So my name is Dandapani. I'm a graphic designer and I'm a design historian based here in Bangalore. And along with Adarsh Rajan, we've put together what we really hope is going to be a very thought-provoking set of talks across this series. I wanted to actually start with a few quick thank yous. This has been a while in the making, this series. First of all, to Rukmini Swaminathan, who was integral to the initial research of this series, to Phantom Hands, who generously supported the series from the first conversation almost 2 years back. To BIC for hosting the series, and to the team for their support in putting this together. And last but not least, all of the speakers who are to come and who've engaged really deeply, I think, with our approach to the series. And I think it's going to make for really stimulating talks. So before we kick off with Kaamya's talk today, I wanted to provide a short note on the larger series and our thinking behind our approach to design history and what we really mean by that. This series is going to run throughout the year, and I'm pleased to announce that the next two speakers who will be here at BIC in person are researcher Karthik Mali, who will be speaking on languages and modernity through metal type, and design scholar Suchitra Balasubramanian, who will be looking at rethinking craft through the work of block carver Maniklal Gajjar. The title of the series is Design History Now, and what we're alluding to with this title is design history as a practice rather than a singular narrative of the past. That is, design history as a discipline or a framework. As we hope will soon become apparent, we're really interested in exploring with you as an audience what the practice of design history encompasses, and I think more importantly, can encompass now and in the future. Design history as an academic field can currently be found in a small number of postgraduate level courses and in professional academic societies and conferences. In the last 10 years, we've seen a growing number of events focused on design history in India, multiple regional and international conferences, online, offline, books and journals, individual talks and exhibitions. Within practice-based courses at undergraduate level and postgraduate level, design history is sometimes included as a module introducing research skills to students so that they can apply these to their design practice. More often, though, it's included as a module to introduce students to the history of design, so a narrative of events, people, and largely canonized objects that led to the students' practice and becoming designers today. And we'll come back to this in a moment. Beyond these formal academic spaces, outlets for design historical writing in the popular design press has also developed with magazines, popular design conferences, coffee table books, and now online platforms, largely aimed at designers, also hosting design historical content. Even more recently, we've seen greater interest from galleries and collectors interested in design objects and designers too. As design history has grown both academically and in the design press, a number of popular focal points have emerged. Monographs have been written, films have been made, countless papers have been delivered and published, and exhibitions have been created focusing on a particular set of people, a selection of institutions, and a specific design canon. Studies of famous designers garner an extremely large part of the design history literature. Prominent art and design institutions and international exhibitions and design bodies are also extremely popular focal points for design history work. And finally, in terms of the design canon, it's a particular set of designers and thinkers whose work is typically approached as the accepted foundation for professional contemporary design practice today. And you can this is sort of representative, I think, of what I'm talking about, which is, a book on Eames as these kind of famous designers, Bauhaus as this kind of integral institution, and this, I don't know how clear it is, but it's graphic design, a concise history, which is this kind of canonical idea of what graphic design history might look like. So this kind of design historical writing has provided us designers with many inspiring biographies and helped bolster the legacy of certain designers, institutions, and a particular canon. However, too narrow a focus on these dominant players risks pointing towards a singular design history rather than plural design histories. As our scope of vision narrows in on these players, it can seem as though these people, institutions, and the accepted canon are the origins or the linchpins around which the design history narrative singular exists. The problem with approaches too narrowly focused on people, institutions, and canons is that they tend to produce celebratory design histories, which places them, these players, at the center of change, possessing a kind of design genius that can be found nowhere else. And this is kind of clearest in the great white men of design, the Corbusiers and the Morrises, the Sotstasses and the Tischels. This approach to historicizing design has too often positioned design and designers with a place in the grand scheme of things that doesn't always feel entirely accurate or complete. We fail to see the ways in which design is the product or consequence of larger social and political forces, as much as, if not more than, a force itself. The design scholar Mahmoud Keshavaz, in his book, The Design Politics of the Passport, describes what he means by the design of politics and the politics of design. And these two sides to design and politics are illuminating in their potential to kind of broaden our understanding of what design history might encompass. The politics of design, he suggests, can be thought of as relations that prescribe in advance what will and will not count as design. In other words, who is called a designer and how one is qualified to talk about design, who understands the language of design and who is allowed to expand that language, who is making constructive criticism and who is foreign to it. Whereas the design of politics, he suggests, can be thought of as the materiality, so that's the things produced by different humans and non-human actors that generate different conditions for certain politics to emerge. So this kind of critical, balanced view of design is really central to our understanding of design in this series as well. Without an eye on the politics of design and the design of politics, we risk design history being a self-referential pursuit. That is, the idea that this particular set of things are important because they were designed by this person, and this person is important because they went to this institution, and this institution is important because of its contribution to the canon, and the canon is made up of these important works designed by these important designers, and we're back to the beginning, providing this kind of circular, insular view of design, which too often provides self-fulfilling prophecies about what is important. When we understand design as consequence, or as a consequence of context, as well as a player in it, the term design itself becomes more nebulous. Too often we view design, I think, as a collection of striking details, the like minutiae of typographic forms or a particular style of women's shoe design. But this kind of obsession with detail represents a rather narrow view of design. Instead, when we understand design as consequence, we reframe design within larger societal contexts, such as capitalism or geopolitics or dominant notions of gender, for example. Importantly, when we extend this understanding to seminal designers, institutions, and canons, we view them as the arbiters of history rather than the makers of it. In this broadened view of design as consequence, with this more nebulous understanding of design, we suggest that it becomes more inclusive as well. The lines drawn between design and these seemingly separate spaces of labor, production, technology start to come into question. Why might one want to draw a distinction between design and craft, for example? And we really look forward to hearing Kaamya speak more on this, I think, in a moment. Why might we want to draw distinctions between the designer and the producers of design, the printers, the manufacturers, and the machines? If we extend the idea of design as consequence, for example, to the passport, we begin to consider the passport not as a beautifully designed object, but as a consequence of exclusionary policies of national governments. That way we look beyond the aesthetics of the object and instead reckon with its very real material conditions that emerge and that it emerges from and creates. Considering the Lota takes us beyond considerations of form and function to delve more deeply into the context of labor and its production. Or one of Chandigar's chairs, to take an example from my own work, becomes intricately connected to nation building, to labor, to skill, and to everyday governmental use. Designer's consequence doesn't free designers from responsibility for their actions. It's critical to also understand the impact of the work that has been put into the world through design. And this can really only be fully understood within context, when we look not only at what one designer wrote about their work and what they made, but who was making their work, what else was being made at the time, what consumers wanted and needed, and a whole host of other questions that cannot be answered through too narrow a focus on designers alone. Some have made the argument that it's okay for design history to be written for designers, and this by extension defends the dominant focal points, I think, of designers' institutions and canons that many designers do find interesting. But I think this does a disservice to designers. Why shouldn't designers want to understand their practice within a broader context? Why should they not want to critically look at the forces that make us do what we do and which shape our work? Understanding design as consequence is less celebratory in nature because it questions the power of design in favor of factors that create design and designers, and connects design to larger issues that are still deeply important to us today and which design, often called a problem-solving discipline, has not yet solved. In this sense, the thrust of this series is a call for more holistic, more inclusive, and sometimes more difficult histories of design. This approach, we argue, has the potential to be more relevant to more people. Holistic, inclusive, and difficult histories help position design in relation to issues of the present and prompt us to think about the larger purpose of the work that we're doing. This series, then, is our exploration of this approach, and we really hope that you will stay with us to explore these questions. We hope to pose some quite specific questions across the series as well, and the number one being, why should anybody care? What is the purpose of design history, and what should it be, and who should it actually be for? What does design history reveal about contemporary realities? What are the boundaries of design history, and what are we studying when we study design? Why is it important to place design within broader political, social, and ecological contexts? And finally, who is doing this and how? Who gets to design history? These are pretty big, sticky, and hopefully quite provocative questions, and we hope that you'll stay with us in this kind of sticky, provocative space for the duration of the series. So with this in mind, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. Kaamya Sharma combines ethnographic, historical, and literary methods to understand the different faces of craft globally. She completed her PhD in cultural studies from Aarhus University, Denmark, and her research has been published in reputed journals such as South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, International Quarterly of Asian Studies, and Journal of Material Culture. She's a board member of the Knowledge House for Craft, a global association for those who create, maintain, and share knowledge around craft, who share a dialogue around craft knowledge. Currently, she's working on a book about the cultural history of the sari, which is based on her doctoral research about sartorial practices and colonialism in southern India. And since we conceptualized this series, Kaamya's name and work have been at the forefront of our minds, with its deep criticality and willingness to ask some quite challenging and at times uncomfortable questions that really ask the reader, I think, to think about their own positioning as a researcher and motivation and viewpoint. This offers a deeply important approach, I think, for design history. And with this, I'd like to welcome Kaamya up to the front.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending your Sunday evening with us. Let me begin by thanking BIC and thanking Nia for inviting me to be a part of this talk series. I'm very excited and happy to be here. When Nia first got in touch with me for this talk series, she was keen that I talk about my work with the craft world. A talk about craft as a way to think about design. This got me thinking, what is the contemporary relationship between craft and design? Today, we are quite used to operating as if craft and design were separate, occasionally interacting worlds with different sorts of practitioners. But how old is this notion? And even more importantly, how useful is this notion? Which all goes to say, how does history and our rendering of it influence the contemporary moment? So it is oddly fitting, perhaps, that we begin a conversation about design history by talking about craft. I think stories are a powerful medium for understanding ourselves and society at large. I have a background in literature and anthropology, so this strongly predisposes me to believe in the power of story. To that end, I am going to be telling you stories through my talk. Stories that will hopefully help us collectively chart a way forward to think about craft and design history, and that will help us uncover forgotten, unexplored histories to counter the cult of celebrity that Nia eloquently elaborated in her introduction. For these stories, I primarily rely on reports and monographs published by officers of the British colonial bureaucracy at the turn of the century, the 19th and 20th centuries. Besides this, I have also referenced design manuals and essays by progenitors of the arts and crafts movement, reports and catalogues from post-independence revival efforts, craft ethnographies, technical and craft histories, and snapshots from my own fieldwork within the craft worlds of Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan. The ideas I present here have been heavily inspired and spurred on by the works of historians Abigail McGowan and Tirthankar Roy, Paul Greenhalgh's work in outlining a craft history, and Tim Ingold's anthropological manifesto to think about craft or to reanimate craft with the notion of skill have also been invaluable. So this is a snapshot of a conversation between two members of a governmental committee from the School of Design, a governmental school of design in Britain in 1846. The two members are Cockerell and Redgrave. And if you can see that there is a little bit of a tug of war or a push and pull between these two members as to the status that we should be according to the various arts. So Cockerell says, would you not say that the painter's art with the knowledge of anatomy, the power of exact imitation, the knowledge of position, color, perspective, foreshortening, illusion, movement and action, all these may be called a poetical art. And a poetical art is juxtaposed against a prosaic art, and a poetical art is given a higher status. Redgrave says, yes. And then Cockerell says, whereas the architect's art or the art of the designer for manufactures is truly a prosaic art. And Redgrave says, I should be sorry to take such a low ground. I conceive that the architect's art is as much addressed to the object of making poetical impressions upon the mind as that of the painter. And then Cockerell comes to the meaty bit. Would you say the same of design as applied to manufactures, to chintzes, to jewelry, to vases, to calico printing and china painting? Redgrave says, even there I conceive that the power of making an impression upon the mind may be exerted as well as in the painter's art. If the poetry of invention does not enter into these designs, we shall never have proper designers. So this speaks to the sort of tensions that occupied the minds of various people about the role of what would be in many circles known as the applied, the decorative, the industrial, the ornamental arts. So craft assumed a weighty significance against the backdrop of the 19th century industrial life in Britain and India. In the 19th century, the modern notion of craft, as driven by taste, sentiment, genius, originality, and creative imagination reached its peak in the arts and crafts movement with the confluence of three distinct ideas and ideologies, namely the decorative arts, the vernacular, and the politics of work. The decorative arts at this point were the disenfranchised arts. The vernacular was a reaction to industrial life, and the politics of work saw in crafts the possibility of an unalienated work as opposed to Marx's figure of the alienated worker. And together, these three ideologies in the form of craft would directly decorate and uplift society. Craft was prized as vernacular, authentic, and traditional, and appealed to a spectrum of ideologies from left to right because of its claim to universal honesty. The movement, led by well-known British thinkers such as William Morris and John Ruskin, viewed India as one of its utopias. By the 20th century, the legacy of the arts and crafts movement had largely been diffused into various national cultures. Many of its ideas continue to wield influence over how we perceive and shape the crafts in contemporary India. Fast forward to the second half of the 20th century, and craft had become institutionalized worldwide as a distinct class based on genres and processes rather than ideas. This crudely translates to weaving could be considered craft because of its engagement with the medium of textiles, whereas car making could not be craft because it involved engagement with the medium of automobiles. Even a wholly handmade automobile like, say, a Rolls-Royce would not be considered craft. Similarly, we tend to talk more about craft from this point onwards as defined by a certain method rather than a sensibility. So art, design, craft was now a fully entrenched tripartite hierarchy, and institutions rarely questioned the amorphous, arbitrarily enforced boundaries between the three. Design was closer to the world of large-scale manufacturing, starting from the 19th century notion of a designer as someone who prepared a template for longer runs of objects. The 20th century cemented the idea that the designer was a professional who handheld the manufacturing process from ideation to finished artifact. Craft was closer to the handmade, however that might be defined. If, for those of you who are interested, if you look at the Handmade Reservation of Articles Act, India 1984, you'll realize that definitions of the handmade can actually shift very expediently. But how did craft relate to the other in this hierarchy, art? Art became increasingly intellectualized and divorced from the notion of skill. Nothing exemplifies this better than Marcel Duchamp's idea of found art. So Marcel Duchamp popularized the idea that discovered artifacts, so found objects, could be considered art through the artist's perception or the artist's sensibility. If art is more a way of seeing things than a way of doing things, then art is very much centered in the individual, not in the object or the society. Art is defined by individual genius. Designers who reached exceptional levels of accomplishment and influence were and are accorded the same status. But craft became tethered to the corollary end of this notion. It was defined almost entirely as a mechanical, non-intellectual practice that was rooted more in community, not the individual. How did this impact the crafts in India? In colonial India, the future of the crafts formed an important metaphor and material concern for the nationalist movement, especially as a struggle of Indian and British elites to establish epistemic and aesthetic authority over the lower social classes. A constellation of actors, ranging from government officials to reformists to nationalists, propagated the idea that craft was essentially different from modern industry. Craft was thus seen as the antithesis of mechanized industry in every way possible. Whether they took a preservationist approach or a modernizing approach, craft interventionists were united in a top-down attitude. believing that craft producers or artisans left to their own devices would let their crafts die out. Indian elites, anxious to distinguish themselves from their colonial overlords while also establishing authority over the rest of India, used the notion of crafts difference, that is, the idea that crafts are different from industry, to justify their engagement in craft. In post-independence India, a crafts conservation outlook took hold, which cast the craft producer as a victim to be protected from the effects of colonization, modernization, or later globalization. Today, craft is frequently envisioned in media discourse as a holistic life world that is ecologically and morally desirable and is heavily romanticized through word images that act, in anthropologist Kaamya Venkatesan's words, as veiled half-truths. The discourse of craft's difference constrains craft producers to behave as objects of development and as statistical figures in need of improvement. While craft producers draw on mythologies of craft to imbue their work with meaning and to further their own agendas, they are obliged to do so in terms set by elite patrons and members of the craft world. So that brings us to where we are today. Craft invokes associations with repetitive manual labor that is part of an unchanging, community-based, endangered tradition. Research and policy making around the crafts have actively propagated this nativist narrative since independence. But were these craft practices really as ancient as we think they are? Or were they at the forefront of the technological advances of their time? What stories might we find if we looked in the archives about change and innovation in the crafts? In today's talk, I will take you through instances from the history of the crafts, especially from my own work with the sari, from weaving mechanisms to dyeing methods, from draping patterns to design preferences. In doing so, my talk rests on the following provocations. First, the crafts that thrived historically combined design capabilities with technological innovation, achieving market success. Second, and this I think speaks particularly to Nia's introduction, our stories about craftsmanship overwhelmingly emphasize the collective, the individual as a figure that pioneered change and innovation in the crafts is buried in our stories about the crafts. This is very telling of our hidden biases regarding craft and design. Through these provocations, I propose that it is time to bridge the divide between craft and design. We need to move away from the slant on craft as an ancient, unchanging tradition by looking at craft as skilled, conscious, embodied, iterative practice that entails creative and technical mastery. Let me begin by telling you a story from my hometown, which is Madurai. This is a story about Tulasi Ram. Indian textiles were long famed for their beauty and technical mastery owing to the fastness and richness of the colors. This was a time when the rest of the world was not familiar with modern techniques, a key aspect of color fastness. Things changed in 1852 when a British chemist called William Perkin serendipitously created the first synthetic dye, an aniline purple called morphine. Aniline dyes were a subclass of coal tar dyes that went into widespread use from the 1870s. This caused a crisis in the Indian markets, which had long held dominance in dyeing through the presence and work of specialist hereditary dyers. Colors were now available in little packets that anybody could buy in a shop, throwing open the dyeing process to anybody who wished to learn. Even as Indian dye stuffs were meticulously displayed at the India pavilions of world exhibitions, the specialist dyers, whose work depended on knowledge of plants, roots, and insects from which the natural dyes were extracted, were becoming redundant in the market, a situational irony that will be familiar to many in the audience today. The Journal of Indian Art at the turn of the century carried several articles lamenting the cheap, garish, loud quality of the new British and German dyes. Take this example from a report titled The Decline of the South Indian Arts. Some European dyes are simply sight-killing and offensive. Many European cloths, if washed, lose their dyes at the first moment and become too ugly for a second wear, though at first sight it is all gaudy, fine, and pleasing. But the Hindu dye never dies such instant death. One exception to the story emerges from the Saurashtras of Madurai. The Saurashtras were producer merchant weavers who combined robust textile knowledge with the social and economic capital necessary to have a stronghold on weaving. At the turn of the century, Madurai was well known for colored silk garments, especially saris. Madurai silk was especially famous for the red dye from which the yarn was colored. The dye came from a local plant, che root. Textile historiographies hold this distinctive color in great regard. The 1980s revival project within Co-optics, Pudupavu, talks with great awe of this red. So this is actually a sample from the Pudupavu catalog. Pudupavu literally means the new warp, and it was part of the various revival projects undertaken by the state in the 1980s. And in fact came under the larger Festivals of India banner. A single sample from Madurai, a deep madder-dyed cotton with gold threads, makes us aware of the possible existence of quality dyeing for local and indigenous markets. We recall that the famous Madurai Chungudi continued to be made up to a generation ago, and most older women in this area still possess such saris in the family, a fine cotton in deep red and black with a gold border and a fine wide-spaced zari check. It would be tie-dyed by women of the Saurashtra community in the south or sent back to Gujarat for tying and returned by brokers. The distinctive reds of Madurai were obtained from a dye plant called Timbura and so on. So these tie-dyed saris, Madurai became synonymous with. In 1895, Tulasi Ram, a Saurashtra weaver trained in Japan, realized the possibility of reproducing the che root brownish red shade with alizarin, making it a fast color. His experiments with combining a suitable mix of local modernting materials and techniques with German dyes was successful, which he then commercialized through a factory setup. N.G. Ranga's Economics of Handloom in South India is a very valuable resource for anyone wishing to understand this time. He notes that adopting the synthetic dyes in the Madurai market allowed the handlooms to compete with mill cloth very effectively in sales. Around this time, an estimated 2,000 color factories and 2,500 red factories existed in Madurai, all but a few being run by the Saurashtras. Tulasi Ram, as a weaver capitalist who wielded social and political influence, was able to realize this instance of successful innovation and scaled adoption to market success in Madurai. Today, many of us still associate Madurai with that distinct shade of brownish red in the Sungudi sari, and its continuity owes no little degree to Tulasi Ram's ingenuity and willingness to experiment. Now let's move to the east, from South India to the east, from dyeing to a story about weaving. This is a story of Dubraj from Bengal. Today we understand saris primarily through geographical brand nomenclatures, that is the Kanjivaram, the Pochampalli, the Baluchar. We actively shop for saris using these names. Sari nomenclatures are a very important part of their branding today. But I've always been curious about how old these nomenclatures actually are. They lend a certain credibility to the sari and to the weave by making it seem like it is part of an ancient hoary tradition. But the evidence to bear out that claim is actually a little scant. So the most valuable resource that textile historians have today, which is John Forbes Watson's The Textile Manufacturers of India from 1866 to 72, have collections ordered by place of acquisition, but there is no connection between this and design style. But then when you fast forward to the 1920s, and a report mentions the importance of borders and headings as important factors in the market, in buyers' decisions, along with price. So one scholarly speculation is that the bordered sari as a geographical brand is actually a 20th century invention, as trade names that emerged organically in the market. Today, a traditional sari, and just to exemplify this, I picked up these screenshots from two very famous sari houses' online catalogs, Nali and Sundari Silks. And you can see that the weave is actually a very big part of the sari's branding. This knowledge is an integral part of consuming these saris. So one such instance of sari nomenclature, the Baluchari sari, may be familiar to craft enthusiasts here. It is named after Baluchar, a suburb of Jiaganj town in Bengal on the banks of river Bhagirathi. Similar to the Jamdani, the Baluchari also has woven figures. But the Baluchari is made entirely of silk, and its figures were distinctive, telling stories, depicting everyday scenes, women grooming themselves, men smoking a hookah, railway carriages with European passengers. These designs were likely drawn from contemporary scenes of the time, clearly not ancient Hori tradition, although it may have derived from ancient older forms of knowledge. 19th century descriptions of Murshidabad silk, Murshidabad is a neighboring district, don't have any mention of the Baluchari, but 1900 onwards the name is evident here and there. These sources also mention Dubraj. The Murshidabad weavers were Hindu Tanti caste or Muslim. Dubraj was a chamar, a leather worker who would never have been allowed to apprentice with a Tanti Hindu weaver. He had a familiarity with leather articles, especially through the making of the skins of musical drums. He learned weaving only as an adult. He had a chance encounter with a Muslim master weaver who imparted to him knowledge of a special Naksha loom. He learned how to construct this loom, made a few in his lifetime, and was the only one who knew how to repair them. He created extraordinary designs on these Naksha, in these looms that he created, but he never shared the knowledge of how to make them with others and reserved the neatest patterns very often for himself. Even the best weavers of the time failed to reproduce his designs. When he died in 1902, no one remained to carry on these designs. A survey from the 1960s done amongst the Murshidabad weavers showed that Dubraj had become something of a local legend. Some of the saris that came from his workshop are now housed in the Indian Museum in Calcutta. Yikes. Sorry about that. There is an example of another weaver from Mirzapur, a contemporary of Dubraj's, called Mrityunjay Sarkar, who apprenticed with a very powerful weaver merchant of the time, Joy Krishna Mandal, and became a celebrated weaver who died rich. He was asked to attempt the same style that Dubraj had developed. He found the Naksha loom, however, too intricate to work with, so he couldn't replicate the Baluchari. And while he couldn't replicate the Baluchari, his own experiments with loom construction were successful. He created bordered apparel and introduced design improvements that were a success in the local market. Master weavers from neighboring towns were able to replicate these designs with great effect. Sarkar's innovations did not have the ingenuity or technical genius that Dubraj possessed, but this ironically made them more transferable and shareable. Dubraj's name sporadically comes up in association with the Baluchari. So this is an example from a leading national daily that does carry mention of Dubraj's name in association with the Baluchari, but it is usually as an afterthought, not as an individual who single-handedly put this name on the crafts map of India. Now let us move back south to Paramakudi, which is a small town in Tamil Nadu. This is the story of Ramaneshwaram. Paramakudi was a fairly important textile town with a large cotton urban handloom cluster. Ranga, from his Economics of Handloom in South India, reports that around 1900, a weaver called Ramaya Ramaneshwaram invented a loom by which 3 cloths could be woven at the same time. we have no further information about this marvelous loom. Just like Dubraj, Ramaneshwaram brought an inventor's sensibility and multidisciplinary knowledge to create this loom. Both of them were skilled carpenters, and they leveraged this knowledge towards effective loom construction and to play with existing loom designs. The weaver cohort in Paramakudi was made nervous about his constant quest for new things. Ramaneshwaram offered to sell the loom at 3 rupees a piece, which was about the same price of a fly shuttle loom around this time. So he offered to sell the loom to his fellow weavers, but they did not take kindly to this offer. Perhaps they expected him to share knowledge of the loom for free. They were also afraid that if his invention became popular, the market would become flooded with oversupply, resulting in an overall drop in prices. One day, they invaded his house and burnt it down, destroying the only available model of the loom. Ramaneshwaram lived and died in dire poverty some years later. Now, these stories certainly give us a lot to mull over. At one level, they present a powerful counter to the notion that the crafts are unchanging traditional practices. Both technological change and design innovations, when successfully adopted and scaled, have played a productive role in the crafts. All three individuals, Tulasi Ram, Dubraj, and Ramaneshwaram, brought multidisciplinary knowledge to their crafts, whether it be dyeing or carpentry. A few more instances to underscore this point. Around 1900, a bulk of the weavers in the Madras Presidency shifted from using the throw shuttle loom to the fly shuttle loom, thanks to the campaigning efforts of Tyagaraya Chetty, a leader and weaver capitalist who wielded substantial influence with the weavers in the Madras Presidency. As you can see, this commemorative stamp released by the Government of India actually immortalizes his relationship with weaving and the deep contributions he made to weaving. Along with the use of mineral dyes and the drop box, a mechanism that allowed for the use of multiple shuttles, this resulted in a shortening of weaving time and allowed for a broader repertoire of designs and cloth widths to be woven at this time. An instance that actually supports the argument that partial mechanization went a long way towards helping the handlooms flourish in this time. This is another instance from a popular interview with Nalli Kuppusamy Chetty, which appeared in the Harvard Business Review. So Kanjivarams today invoke a strong sense of nostalgia, but the bordered silk sari in Kanchipuram was only really developed in the late 19th century. This interview with Nalli Kuppusamy Chetty is instructive in this regard. He says that the demand for pure silk saris arose in the south about 150 years back, and at that time, pure silk saris could only be obtained from Banaras. Kanchi weavers took advantage of this opportunity and switched to making silk saris to compete with Banaras. But instead of distinguishing themselves through the heavy use of gold thread, which is a signature feature of the Banaras, they went for the extensive use of colored yarn and stronger contrasts between body and border through the famed Korvai technique. The Korvai technique uses 2 or 3 more shuttles carrying separate weft yarns, resulting in borders that are sort of joined to the main body of the sari. In the decades since, this has become a signature feature of the Kanjivaram. So the Kanchi Korvai sari, which is a sari today prized for being rasi, or which is a Tamil word for auspicious, is then no more than 150 years old, and a direct result of the innovations of the weavers in Kanchipuram at this time. Now for a story within a story about drape. Many of you may be familiar with this novel, may have read this novel by this very celebrated writer. This is an excerpt from Amitav Ghosh's The Glass Palace, which describes the ups and downs in the lives of the Burmese royal family after the British invasion of Burma in the late 19th century. As the royal family are exiled to live in small, remote Ratnagiri, which is in present-day Maharashtra, Queen Supalayat and the 4 princesses have to negotiate the challenges of life in this partially familiar but still alien land. In 1905, a new district collector, a Bengali man from Calcutta, arrives in town with his wife in tow. The queen notices that his wife, Uma De, is wearing her sari differently, with odds and ends borrowed from European costume, a petticoat, a blouse. Furthermore, she had heard that women all over India were adopting this new style. Uma, who impresses the queen with her self-possession and poise, then proceeds to tell the royal family how to wear the sari in this new style. So this little snippet from the novel actually captures that little moment. The first thing, the king and the queen are together. The first thing he noticed about them was that the new Madame Collector was dressed in an unusual garment. Puzzled, he handed his binoculars to the queen. "What's that she's wearing?" The queen took a long look. "It's just a sari," she said at last, "but she's wearing it in a new style." So this exiled foreign royal at this point takes her cues on fashion from the wife of a civil servant, a key insight that Amitav Ghosh affords into the cultural influence wielded by elite women who moved in the circles of the colonial bureaucracies. Indeed, for most Indians today, even today, the district collector is often the highest ranking representative of the state that they are likely to encounter in person. The collector's wife, therefore, was and is a key cultural figure who potentially played a vital role in spreading metropolitan or nationalist tastes to different parts of India. Ghosh most likely adapted this episode from a true historical vignette about the modern Nivi sari. The modern Nivi sari, as we know it today, is believed to be a variation of the Parsi gara, which was made popular in Gujarat, and this is typically worn with a blouse and a petticoat. This drape is believed to have been popularized and worn first by Jnanadanandini Devi, wife of civil servant Satyendranath Tagore and sister-in-law of Rabindranath Tagore. As the wife of a public figure and a Bhadra Mahila, she would frequently attend public events, breaching the boundaries of Zanana life. So the sartorial changes that are taking place around this time can be understood in the context of the social and cultural changes taking place in the 19th century. Parsi women, like their European counterparts, did not live in zananas, which were the inner rooms of a household reserved for women in the family, where they lived secluded away from public life and scrutiny. Instead, it was part of their role as women, part of Parsi women's role as women, especially as wives, to participate in social life, and their sartorial styles reflected this life. Whereas zananas, an Indo-Islamic practice followed by both Hindu and Muslim upper classes, removed the constraint of modesty in women's clothing. We can only speculate today about cause and effect, whether the sartorial style influenced the Zanana culture or whether the Zanana culture influenced the sartorial style. But this is a speculation that clearly the Welsh travel writer Fanny Parks also had. So this is an observation she made when she was at a when she saw Bengali women's dress at a party that she attended in 1826. On beholding their attire, I was no longer surprised that no other men than their husbands were permitted to enter the zanana. The dress consisted of one long strip of Banaras gauze of thin texture with a gold border passed twice around the limbs with the end thrown over the shoulder. The dress was rather transparent, almost useless as a veil. When Jnanadanandini and her husband moved to Bombay in 1864, it gave them the opportunity to absorb practices prevalent in Western India, especially in female dress. It was here that she, with her husband's active encouragement, adopted the embellished blouses and petticoats worn under the saris by Parsi women. Instead of wearing the pallu over the right shoulder, she improvised the drape by wearing the pallu over the left shoulder, so that the right hand remained free for courtesies. As one of the first elite women to break the bounds of seclusion created by Zanana culture, she also popularized this drape through articles, through draping sessions, and so on. There is ever-growing scholarly and cultural recognition of Jnanadanandini's role in designing this iconic drape. But it is striking that the story of the Nivi sari is told today in craft circles as being the result of an individual's pioneering efforts rather than a practice of the community. Now I take you to the present, finally. From my own fieldwork, this is a snapshot from my own fieldwork in Jodhpur, Rajasthan with Ramesh Mandal. From Kashmir to Bihar, Rajasthan to Masulipattnam, the Mughal Empire helped diffuse knowledge of carpet manufacturers across India through master artisans who migrated from West Asia, and brought specific design systems with them. By the mid-19th century, carpets had consolidated themselves as an article in the global market as a standard of interior decoration in Euro-America, thus cementing steady, continuous demand. This continues to the present day. Many tourists from Euro-America look to take back dharis from their travels in India. Ramesh is a dhari weaver I met in Salavas, which is a village 60 kilometers outside Jodhpur, off the national highway towards Pali. Ramesh is a third-generation weaver whose grandfather moved from Pakistan to settle in Salavas. Today, he prefers the flexible hours and freedom of working from home that weaving affords him. He lives in his own house with a large compound. Ramesh works with cotton, goat, and camel wool to weave dharis of many standardized dimensions. Often he constructs a loom depending on the nature of an order, its dimensions, the material needed, and so on. Neither a beneficiary of the state nor part of a caste guild or weaver community network, in fact, he takes active care to distance himself from such, Ramesh is a self-styled loan operator who relies entirely on the market for his work. For one of his commissions, he reproduced this Bauhaus design accurately on a cotton dhari, entirely hand-woven. There are no recurring patterns in this dhari, as you can see, making it a design that would be very difficult to automate. Ramesh intuitively understood that this was a design that could only be recreated on a dhari by hand. He produced an object of outsized, unique value in the process. As we have seen so far, technological and design innovations have certainly advanced weaving in many instances, but just so has weaving often formed the foundation for important technological progress. Perhaps the most famous instance of this is how the Jacquard loom was actually a precursor for Babbage's concept of the analytical engine, and by extension, the world of modern computing. So the Jacquard was a mechanism developed by the eponymous Joseph-Marie Jacquard, a French inventor and weaver from the 19th century. And this invention of his forever changed the trajectory of patterned weaving. So let me explain this a little further. A lot of weaving results in the creation of simple, unadorned cloth, on which designs are then created through other techniques, such as, for instance, painting or dyeing. Woven designs throughout history were painstaking work that required a lot of time. Weaving happens one line of yarn thread at a time, for anyone familiar with the process of weaving, with the interlocking of warp and weft threads. The Jacquard was a mechanism which automated design creation in weaving. So the Jacquard loom used punch cards with pre-encoded designs, as you can see here, that would control the warp threads to create designs in the woven cloth. The Jacquard loom revolutionized weaving as we knew it. Note that it is not the same as a power loom, as there are hand looms which use the Jacquard mechanism. Banarasi weavers, for instance, were able to successfully adopt the Jacquard mechanism at some point to create the elaborate brocades that they were famous for. Praveena Shukla's ethnography, it's a book called The Grace of Four Moons, for those of you who are interested in looking at Banarsi weaving a little bit more deeply, talks about the punch card makers. So they were almost a cottage industry of their own in Banaras at some point, because this had evolved to that degree. This is yet more proof of the argument that partial mechanization actually aided the handlooms, especially handloom weavers of highly skilled and embellished cloth. But the Jacquard loom also provided the template for modern computing. The Jacquard system broke down a set of complex design data down to a binary, which is to lift the warp thread or to not lift the warp thread. This was the basis also for binary code, breaking down complex information into binary format, zeros or ones, true or false. Binary code in turn became the basis for modern computing. Just as designs are encoded into the punch cards which are used in the Jacquard loom, physical punch cards were used as a means of data storage in computing well into the 1980s. Such is the shared history between these technologies. Another really interesting historical vignette. In the 20th century, weaving also enabled one more unsurpassed technological feat for mankind: NASA's Apollo mission that put humans on the moon. One of the challenges of the mission was developing a stable, reliable, and portable computer to navigate the spacecraft. The core memory for Apollo's guidance computer, which would man the spacecraft, was entirely handwoven by skilled women weavers. These women wove the computer's core memory using metal wires threaded through tiny donut-shaped ferrite rings or cores to represent ones and zeros. All of this core memory was handwoven, with women sitting on opposite sides of a panel, passing a wire-threaded needle back and forth to create a particular pattern. Sometimes a woman worked alone, passing the needle through the panel to herself. Apollo engineers called this method of building core memory LOL, the little old lady's method. Core memory was also known as rope memory, and the women who supervised this work were called rope mothers. Engineers at this time had barely scratched the surface in learning how to use computing to ensure an error-free and reliable system for critical missions, such as the Apollo mission. The craftsmanship of these skilled weavers played a pivotal role in making this a reality. This vignette and the vignette before this one illustrates the pivotal role craftsmanship continues to play in the creation of radical new tech. In a tribute project called Making Core Memory, researchers who examined the Apollo mission as part of the history of human-computer interaction, or HCI, note that the worlds of handwork and computing are not as separate as we imagine them to be. Craftsmanship can indeed both inspire and be inspired in turn by the cross-pollination with different knowledge forms and technologies. Another excellent example is the work of researcher and textile artist Nidya Kusmaya from Indonesia, who works with microfarming, using microorganisms such as microfungus and bacteria to create natural color. An ingenious solution that leverages natural processes while providing the uniformity and replicability of synthetic dyes. Kusmaya has been working with microorganisms to realize these batik patterns, a scalable alternative to vegetable and other natural dye sources. Anybody who has worked with bacterial cultures in any form will be able to tell you that the process is painstaking, involves a lot of skill, knowledge, and a very minute attention to detail. Talk to anyone who's obsessed with fermentation and they will tell you this story for sure. So this too is craftsmanship. What is the way forward for reimagining a design history that can encompass all of this? These instances are intended to illustrate my principal arguments in charting a way forward for craft and design history. First, the crafts have always been modern and creative. Innovation is why they have survived. By freezing the crafts as an unchanging, museumized representation of an imagined past, we have done them a grave injustice. Instead, we must see craft as a dynamic, changing space formed by the tension between change and continuity. Second, the individual is a rather forgotten figure in the crafts. Despite many craft practices, having thrived directly as a result of the genius of specific individuals. It is telling that today the names of revivalists or cultural brokers, such as, for instance, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, rise immediately to our minds, but we are hard put to recall the names of weavers or other innovators who have made a similar impact for the crafts. If craftsmanship consists of highly specialized knowledge that is difficult to share or transfer, it is all the more important that we understand and properly record the role of the individual in these communities. Thirdly, every instance of innovation happens at the cross-pollination of disciplines and knowledge forms. This has two aspects. One, we must reimagine the relationship between craftsmanship and mechanization as one that is complementary rather than antagonistic. Take the example of Kanjuro Shibata. He comes from a lineage of Japanese longbow makers who make bows that are prized for their quality, handling, and precision, especially in the art of kyudo marksmanship. He carves them from raw bamboo and inserts over 100 wedges into each bow manually to create the perfect curve. But he does not make the wedges by hand. He uses an electric saw to make the wedges, thus intuitively understanding where handmaking adds value and where it would not. So that is my first intervention, that we must reimagine the relationship between craftsmanship and mechanization or automation as one that is complementary rather than antagonistic. My second intervention is that designers need deep working knowledge of the crafts to be able to design with the crafts. The future of design lies in incorporating the handmade where it adds value, aesthetics, and comfort, rather than to be guided by moralistic decisions about the role of the handmade. Every instance of innovation that I've outlined in my talk happened at the juncture where deep knowledge or skill from one field was successfully applied in another. So we are looking at a reimagining of the designer as a designer craftsperson, someone who can combine the tacit embodied knowledge of craft with design capabilities. Finally, and this is a broader intervention for all of us, whether we have an expert interest in design and craft or whether we have a lay interest in design and craft, our collective memory for history does not extend very far. Given this relative brevity, we enshrine specific practices as traditional, as continuous, as unchanging. And if they have been unchanged over time, then it follows that they must remain unchanged over time. But what is our starting point? Is it the 1920s, the 1880s, the 1700s, or even further back? To counter this fallacy of historical memory, I offer an alternative for all of us to consider. Every time we encounter craft practices we perceive as old, we must ask ourselves, what if they were the result of a design or technological innovation of their time? What if artisanal communities that we see as inheritors of a long-standing practice simply had one ancestor in the not-so-far-away past who was trying to be ahead of the technological advances of their time? This would have far-reaching consequences for craft and design. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. I think it's been a fantastic way to start, and I think quite a provocative way to start a series on design history. But I also really appreciate the way that you finished. I'm not sure if this is what you intended, but with this idea of how much do we actually know, I think is a question for more research, more questioning, and I think that's a great place to start. So we're going to open it up to questions as well. I'll just start with something that was on my mind, and then we'll open it up to the audience too. But one of the things that that really sort of piqued my interest quite early on, particularly in the language that you used, was that at one point you spoke of play and multidisciplinary, and I think that often in at least in contemporary design practice, those are ways of describing at least one particular facet of design practice, which is very cherished by designers, that we're playful, that we're multidisciplinary. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to, of course, you're talking about innovation and craft and innovation, but where does that idea of play and multidisciplinarity come into that idea of innovation with craft as well? Because I think that that's another crossover that I'm very interested in.
Thank you, Nia. I think one of the things that I intended with this talk and with the way that I have conjoined these stories together is that I want to bring these figures a little bit closer, because I don't think we talk about multidisciplinarity and play so much when we talk about craft producers as much as we talk about designers. And I think that too is very revelatory about the biases that we have and the ways in which we have very specific ideas about where these fields belong in the larger kind of realm of creativity. So I think the idea behind using those words very deliberately in talking about these craft stories was to sort of bring these figures together in people's imaginations, that perhaps they're not so different as we unconsciously or subconsciously seem to think they are.
Thank you. So I'll open it up to the audience and we'll go back and forth and continue. Yeah. So I think, so we have some roaming mics, and as this is being recorded, I'd just ask everybody to wait until the mic gets to you. Just at the back, we have a question. Thank you.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, so I was just wondering, with respect to, you talked a lot about the community impact of, the community impact in crafts, rather, I'd say. And you also talked about the individuality of, say, a particular craftsperson in forwarding the craft and spreading it around in the world. I was wondering about how those two interacted in the sense of people like Dubraj or people like Anish Kapoor who, sort of acquire certain kind of technology or certain kind of new method of doing something and do not share it with the community, and that which could also lead to other people who would have worked with the technology for the further use of it, spread it a little bit more, not being able to use it. I mean, I'm just wondering as to how that interacts with each other, like the individuality and the community effort in the crafts.
Thank you. That's a fabulous question, and I'm really glad that you raised it. So this is something that I thought about a lot also over the course of this research. I think there are certain, we also perhaps, a useful way of looking at this is to think about the social, cultural conditions that enable knowledge sharing. And clearly those conditions were absent in Dubraj's case or in any of the other cases, right? But in the cases where that has been the case, perhaps it would be useful for us to look at what were the particular social and cultural factors that enable that kind of knowledge sharing. So, for instance, with respect to Dubraj, he was an outlier. He was a complete kind of like maverick genius that nobody was prepared for at that point, and nobody really knew how to replicate later on, and he definitely played an active role in that. But the fact that he was not part of that system of apprenticeship, for instance, which was the way the Tanti weavers were continuing their practice, would have played a role. There are definitely many concerns about the protection of knowledge that can be commercialized, intellectual property, all of that are also at play here. So do we have proper mechanisms, legal mechanisms in place to protect this kind of knowledge from being commercialized in improper ways or by the wrong people? That's another question worth asking. the instances where the individuals were actually willing to share this knowledge for the larger good of the community, what was at play there? What were the factors? What were the social and cultural factors that enabled that? Maybe there was a larger interest in the welfare of that particular community, in seeing the upliftment of that community. Perhaps that was a factor. But I think the question you ask speaks to a very important concern about the continuity of knowledge itself. Where that happens and where that does not happen, and why, are very important questions to ask. Thank you.
So I have to apologize because there's so many thoughts in my mind after your talk and your opening contextualization of this whole series that I'm trying to be precise, but I might still wander a little bit. So I'm going to begin. I mean, if anybody thinks I'm taking too much of the mic, just stop me and grab it. But I'm just going to begin by saying I appreciate your comment about the self-referential aspect of history and in this case, design history. But I think I'm a writer and an editor and a publisher of short fiction, and I see that that is also something that very much impacts the way in which writing progresses. As you investigate the short story, you see that, people with creative writing degrees or MFAs, there's a kind of a context that's set, and you really have to examine how you're going to tell different stories. And so that was one comment, and that led me, therefore, to appreciating your leading into your lecture with these stories. And I wondered, because again, so much of literature is dominated by the male voice for a long time, I wondered very much whether there is a documentation of contributions from domestic, the domestic world of these communities who were also contributors to the craft. And so, yes. Sorry, it was really complicated, but still.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a lovely thought and a lovely question. I completely agree with you about the world of writing. In fact, at the risk of nerding out a little bit, I must bring up this article that I read a few years back, which talked about the fact that a lot of the writers' awards that are given today, it's almost a precondition that they have MFAs or other institutionalized recognitions of credibility. Whereas you go back, maybe even like the first or second half of the 20th century, many of them didn't even go to college. The most immortal writers that we can think of, they never even went to college. So that speaks to an important concern about how we understand credibility, expertise, how we understand genius, all of that. The second question that you raise is also, it's a concern, and to speak very broadly, in terms of the histories of craft, women very often played a facilitating supportive role. So if you look at the histories of weaving especially, you'll find that a lot of the spinning, a lot of the warping, and the thread counting, all of that was done by the women. But that was typically seen as low value, unskilled labor that facilitated the highly skilled, specialized weaving, which was often undertaken by men. This is not exactly, to sort of present a counter picture to that, I find, for instance, if I look across the globe today, a lot of the people that practice so-called studio craft across geographical contexts, especially in highly westernized countries, I find that a lot of those weavers are actually women. So I find this contrast also very telling, that a lot of those studio craft weavers are women, but a lot of the weavers that we think of as weavers in India are men who come from these institutionalized, entrenched communities. That is not an answer, but it's a thought. It's an ellipsis.
Hey Kaamya, thanks for a fantastic talk. I was really impressed by some of the examples you gave, right? These designers you talk about lived in their communities. They understood what their communities needed, and they understood how the materials they worked with and the tools they used work. And if you look at how contemporary design practice works today, I hate to call it like almost an ideification where it becomes commoditized, where a lot of designers, we work in consultancies, and the expectation is you jump into, say, a particular client's problem or a particular sector, and you apply a set of mental models or constructs, like design thinking or whatever, like that. And you're not there to see the result of what you've designed go into the world. Like you're moving on to the next project. And I think that that's one big loss that we as a practice have had, that this that design has something that's being kind of co-opted into this kind of business logic, or it's something that we believe designers know better than others, and we jump into it and we say, hey, we're the designers, we know this solution. And I think your focus that designers should know craft intimately, they should also know context intimately, like maybe they should be more humble about the skill set they have and the knowledge they have, and not kind of think of themselves as above the people they're designing for, which is something which is way too common today. And it's a mentality which I feel is way too common in design education as well, in my experience. Yeah.
Very eloquently put. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you. And I completely agree.
And I think one thing I would add to that is also, I think, an interesting extension of some of what we're seeing is the co-option of language of craft in design as well. So we begin to see people talking about the craft of typography and the craft of type design. And so I think that that's an interesting kind of flip that we're beginning to see. I wonder, do you have any thoughts on why designers might now be looking to craft in this way?
Well, one thought that I do have, which I think links the two comments, is that I think the corporate world is very, very competent at adopting or appropriating the language of something, whether it is the language of social justice or the language of craft or the language of design, but then furthering their own ends while disguising that in the garb of this language. Yeah, so that's something that's certainly happening, and I do feel, especially with the consultancies and the idea that you never see the result materialized outside, that certainly does happen. I don't know about designers adopting or wanting to, because I also feel that the word craft is sometimes very loosely used, like writers talk about craft, and I'm not sure very often what it is they mean. And this is where I would circle back to the idea of craft as skill. If it is the idea that you must learn a certain kind of skill and a certain kind of knowledge, and this knowledge will not often be available to you in very easy articulation. It is knowledge that defies language. It is knowledge that only comes through practice and continuous embodied iterative practice. I find each of those words very deliberate and very meaningful, which is why I really love Tim Ingold's work. For anyone who's interested, he has this essay on 8 questions relating to craft as skill, which I think is very important for practitioners across fields to look at. But if they are approaching the idea of craft as skill, and skill is something that is embodied and acquired through continuous practice, then I think we're headed in the right direction. But I don't know if that is what's happening.
No, I think it's interesting that I think sometimes this is happening because there's a recognition and perhaps a sort of attempt at humbling towards realizing that there is skill in design which is shared with craft, and that these distinctions are not as clear as we make them out to be. There's another question at the back.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. So yeah, my thoughts are not fully formed, but it's coming from painting, so say Kalighat, Patachitra, to even performing arts, so folk artists. And I wanted to build on this idea of individuals versus community. And I was wondering, how do we imagine forms of recognition when it comes to recognizing and acknowledging individuals as knowledge holders? Like the way I understand it, one form was patronage for such a long time. Putting a value in terms of a monetary value is another form, but something like Patachitra, where there are 300 families making the same painting, and there's one person who's gotten an opportunity to then attend all the fairs. What happens to the 299? And how do we, acknowledge individuality in communities? And how do we need to imagine recognition? And would love to know your thoughts on that.
So the state already has certain imaginations of recognition, right? We have the national awards, and the national awards are typically given to master practitioners of a particular community. And you raise a very valid question when you say, what about the other 299? We know of the one, and the one who gets to travel to Paris for the World Exhibition, who will benefit perhaps, and we don't even know actually, but who we assume might benefit from that award citation. I think, and this is probably a very inadequate answer, but I think a start would lie in storytelling. To me, it's really sad that, when I was doing this research, I should not have had to dig so deep to find these stories. They should have been more readily available, given that the public has a certain interest in craft, in craftsmanship, in forms of making. These stories should have been more readily available to the public. The stories that we're already telling in our magazines, in our newspapers, they seem to emphasize the community overwhelmingly. So let us start at least according recognition there. And if we continue to do that, I think it might break some of the kind of elitism that patterns our thinking about the crafts, about forms of making. Like I said, I think that is not adequate. It's barely a start, but yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking talk. So my question was more around what we choose to study when we talk about design history. So it seems to me like time is a really important factor when we consider design history, and things that have lasted over time are incredibly well designed, so they ought to be studied. So, for example, I know of Harappan houses which had stairs in their houses, and I still have stairs in my house. So, it seems to me like stairs is an incredibly well designed object, and it should be like studied. So, when you talk about what design history is or what ought to be studied, then where does the time factor sort of figure in into the research? Thank you.
I think it's an interesting question whether longevity should be our measure of value. Can you speak to this in craft, and maybe we can circle back to you? Yeah.
So I'll say this. Time certainly plays a role in legitimizing craft. And it may not very often be the time that the individual has put into the craft. It will be, he's a third generation weaver. His family has been doing this for 200 years. So there is this assumption that there is some understanding that has filtered through all of that time in giving that craft a certain authenticity. But your question is about how perhaps we could be employing, or what qualifies as legitimate or substantive amount of time spent understanding something, right? Now the answer to that will obviously have to be very open-ended. But I think what's more important is good faith, continuous engagement, and to never feel as if we have arrived at any form of expertise or any form of final understanding is a good start. How is that going to pragmatically inform, for instance, the institutionalization of design history as a discipline? How long should a course be? How many semesters should that have? Like, those are questions that are impossible to speak to. And of course, there will be imperfect answers that people will come up with every now and then. Some committee will say, 2 years is enough. Another committee will say, no, you need to do this for at least 10 years before you can be considered an expert. But I think the larger philosophy of never feeling as if you have arrived at a definitive understanding of something and that it's always continuous is a good place to be.
I think we're about at time. Yeah? So if there's any more questions, I think one more question we could take quickly, and then thank you.
I firstly want to thank Kaamya and Nia for curating this talk. And I think my question is more to do with something that I noticed that Kaamya had mentioned about the vernacular sort of sense of art, craft, and design. And what I want to ask both of you is that she'd mentioned that vernacular is sort of a reaction towards industrial life. And I'm wondering if the portion where Nia had spoken about, looking at a pluralistic context towards, design history and historical practices, if that could sort of lend to the idea that maybe vernacularism and vernacular art and design could, possibly will have like a different viewpoint also. It need not necessarily be a reaction, but could be a development. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Shall I? Yeah. Thank you for that question. So what made the arts and crafts movement really powerful in its initial imagination is that these ideas, if you examine them individually, they seemingly have nothing to do with each other. Like an importance given to the vernacular, what does that have to do with the politics of work? Seemingly nothing, but they found a way to marry these three very distinct ideas that, we need to think about forms of work, we need to think about forms of the local and the vernacular that may be disappearing because of the large-scale standardization introduced by industrial life. So it was really powerful in that sense. But perhaps somewhere along the way, we have begun to fetishize the vernacular or the local, and I'm sure I can see that many of you are recalling instances where you have perhaps felt that there was a fetishization of the local or the vernacular, right? That, I believe, is a trap we should not fall into. And if we can steer clear of that, while also thinking about pluralistic approaches to understanding and conceiving of design history, of crafts history, then I think we would be headed in the right direction.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent... Yes, yeah, please, if we have time.
Thank you. This was a really wonderful talk. I have a question regarding the vocabulary inflation that is happening with this word craft, design and all. And before I do that, I just want to explain what I do. I'm a user experience designer. I spend a lot of time with my team trying to craft experiences and all. So one of the things I'm trying to always do is trying to push for content also as a part of design. Now, you just had a very interesting discussion regarding the corporate interventions that are in a way making a sort of erosion of these practices and defining designs in a certain way. And I believe that I'm part of that sort of culture. Like I have been both an evangelist and a culprit of trying to expand the definition of design or craft. So what I really want to ask you is that in your practice of talking to the people, working with the weavers, because I spend a lot of time where I'm trying to say this is the design part, this is the strategizing part, this is not even a design part, this is just people management part, right? In your practice of or at least the people you spoke to, do they also have these definitions of craft? Like this is the part that is a craft and this is not the craft itself. And how much of this matters in trying to define and trying to be inclusive of the history of craft and design itself? Because what the people who are the practitioners themselves are doing should also be incorporated in this conversation. So I just wanted to know your thought about that.
Okay, I have like a really roundabout way of answering your question. So the thing that I find really interesting about UX is it's a lot of the principles in UX are actually drawn from the field of anthropology and qualitative research. It's this notion of ethnography, that you participate, observe a certain group of people that you are seeking to understand, and there is no distance between you and that group. That is a fundamental principle that UX is very effectively leveraged into design, into crafting experiences, as you said, right? Now, anthropology, there's this ongoing conversation in anthropology about how much we let our, first it was called subjects, and then subjects became politically incorrect, and then they started saying interlocutors. And so how do you let the people you are speaking with, how far do you let them define the terms of the conversation, right? And of course, many anthropologists believe that they should be allowed to set the terms of the conversation. They should be allowed to define these in their own ways, and those are the definitions that we should adopt. There's this guy called David Graeber, a very famous anthropologist who was also associated with the Occupy Wall Street movement. In one of his essays, he was like, so what if you're working with neo-Nazis? What if you're working with skinheads? Do you allow them to define themselves? Or do you impose your definition of what they are? So there is a tension there between what that person's self-understanding of, I'm using a very extreme kind of example to illuminate this tension, right? And that's a tension that animates UX as well. Again, I don't think there's like a yes or no answer. There's no binary answer. But to be aware of that tension is useful. That there are limits to how much we assimilate their understanding for various reasons. But that there is always a good faith engagement with their understanding or their worldview. Yeah, I hope that helps. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say after the last question, that seems like a great place to end. But actually, I think this is a great place to end because I think what you've also illuminated is something I'd like to end on, which is that I think we sort of scratched the surface of your work and your practice and your approach. And I would really encourage everybody to go and read more of Kaamya's work to get this kind of broad sense of what you do and your approach and your kind of knowledge base that you're drawing on. So thank you very much. And as I said, we've got further talks coming up in the next few months, which will go up on the BIC website. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.
Thank you so much.